Jeff Bezos, the billionaire founder of Amazon and one of the richest men in the world, is known for his sharp business acumen and futuristic vision. But recently, during a high-profile international economic summit that was broadcast live across multiple global platforms, Bezos found himself in hot water after making what many perceived to be a dismissive and mocking remark toward an African leader, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The summit, meant to foster dialogue on sustainable development and equitable global investment, brought together world leaders, CEOs, and policy influencers. Things took a surprising turn during a panel discussion on the role of emerging nations in the future digital economy. Jeff Bezos, seated comfortably among other powerful figures, made a comment that drew immediate backlash. When President Traoré passionately spoke about Africa's untapped potential, the need for respect in international partnerships, and the resilience of African youth, Bezos interjected with a smirk, saying, "That's an ambitious vision for a country that doesn't even have stable internet access in most regions." The audience let out a collective gasp. The comment, whether meant as a joke or not, was widely seen as condescending. Social media exploded within minutes. Hashtags like #CharmRespectAfrica, Traoré Bezos, and Africa Rising began trending globally. But what truly flipped the narrative was how President Traoré responded, not with anger, not with silence, but with a calm, pointed, and deeply intelligent clapback that silenced the room. President Traoré leaned forward, looked Bezos in the eye, and said, "Mr. Bezos, I respect your achievements. But let me remind you, the internet you're speaking of is your invention. The intelligence behind it is human. The ambition you're questioning is African. A continent that was exploited, divided, and dismissed for decades is now standing tall and speaking with its own voice. We may not have fiber optics in every village, but we have vision. And a people who rise even when the world expects them to fall. Africa isn't asking for your permission to grow. We are growing, whether you acknowledge it or not." The entire room fell into a stunned silence before erupting into applause. Jeff Bezos, usually confident and poised, was visibly caught off guard. Traoré's response was not only diplomatic and powerful, it carried the weight of centuries, of overlooked history and the fierce pride of a continent on the rise. This moment quickly went viral. Major news outlets picked it up, and political commentators from around the world weighed in. Many praised Traoré for his poise and clarity. Analysts pointed out that the African president used the moment to highlight an issue often ignored: the double standards applied to African nations when it comes to development, innovation, and potential. Traoré's words sparked conversations in boardrooms, universities, and communities. He wasn't just defending his country, he was defending an entire continent. And in doing so, he reminded the world that Africa's leaders are no longer content to be sidelined or talked down to. In the days following the incident, Jeff Bezos issued a statement saying his words were taken out of context and that he meant no disrespect. But by then, the damage was done, and the respect for Traoré had skyrocketed. Young Africans flooded social media with videos and messages of support, quoting Traoré's statement and posting images of technological innovations being made across the continent. From fintech startups in Nigeria to solar energy breakthroughs in Kenya and AI labs in Rwanda, they showcased the very ambition Bezos had questioned. In the end, this wasn't just a diplomatic win for President Traoré. It was a symbolic victory for Africa, a message that global respect is no longer optional when engaging with African leadership. It was a turning point in how power dynamics are shifting, and how Africa, long underestimated, is finally demanding and commanding the global spotlight. Just weeks after the intense exchange between Jeff Bezos and President Ibrahim Traoré, another high-profile encounter made headlines, this time involving French President Emmanuel Macron and a young African climate activist named Awa Diarra from Mali. The setting was the Global Climate Forum in Geneva, where world leaders, scientists, and youth representatives had gathered to discuss the escalating climate crisis. Awa, only 24 years old, had been invited to speak on behalf of the Global South, to voice the concerns of millions facing the harshest effects of climate change with the fewest resources. During her speech, Awa passionately highlighted the devastating floods in West Africa, prolonged droughts in the Sahel, and the loss of crops that feed entire communities. She challenged the hypocrisy of industrialized nations, stating, "You pollute the most, yet lecture us on sustainability. You offer aid with one hand while investing in oil with the other." The audience gave her a standing ovation, but moments later, President Macron took the stage and attempted to downplay her statements. With a rehearsed smile, he said, "It's important to channel youthful passion, but we must also recognize the complexity of energy transitions. Countries like Mali must focus on stability before making such demands." It was a classic political deflection, polished, diplomatic, but deeply patronizing. Awa, however, was not intimidated. As the microphone passed back to her for a panel discussion, she didn't miss a beat. She turned to Macron and replied, "Mr. President, stability does not mean silence. My people are stable enough to farm, to raise families, to build communities, until climate change, largely caused by your industries, washes their lives away. Complexity is not an excuse for delay. If my voice is too passionate for your comfort, maybe it's because I'm speaking for those buried by floods your planes never see." The crowd was stunned. Cameras flashed. Macron nodded slowly but said nothing. For once, words failed him. International media praised Awa's courage and eloquence. Environmental groups rallied behind her, and hashtags like Yoor, Awa Diarra Speaks, Trends, Climate Justice Now, and Listen to the South trended across platforms. She was invited to join the advisory board of several climate coalitions and appeared on major news outlets where she repeated one key message: "We don't need sympathy. We need honesty, equity, and action." Awa Diarra's confrontation with Macron became more than just a viral moment. It was symbolic of a generational shift. A new wave of African leaders, thinkers, and activists are no longer asking politely for a seat at the table. They are claiming it, speaking truth to power and refusing to be silenced. And the world, whether ready or not, is being forced to listen. In yet another powerful moment that rocked global discourse, a tense exchange unfolded at the World Innovation and Tech Expo in Berlin. This time the spotlight was on Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, known for his controversial statements and bold technological visions. Opposite him stood Dr. Zanele Mbatha, a South African robotics engineer and MIT graduate, representing the African AI Consortium. The event's theme was "The Future of AI and Robotics," and the panel included some of the most influential minds in tech. Musk, never one to shy away from provocative opinions, was asked about the inclusion of Africa in AI development. With a chuckle, he responded, "Africa is interesting, but let's be honest. The real breakthroughs in AI aren't going to come from places still dealing with power outages." The comment sent ripples through the auditorium. The laughter from a few attendees was quickly drowned out by uneasy murmurs. But Dr. Mbatha didn't flinch. When it was her turn to speak, she addressed the elephant in the room head-on. She looked directly at Musk and said, "Elon, I admire your innovations, but dismissing a continent because it doesn't look like Silicon Valley is short-sighted. The first time I coded a neural net, it was during load shedding using a laptop charged on a solar panel in a rural town. Innovation isn't about luxury, it's about necessity, and Africans are masters of making brilliance out of scarcity." The applause started slow, then grew into a thunderous standing ovation. Mbatha continued, "Africa is developing its own AI to solve African problems. From using machine learning to predict droughts in Ethiopia, to robotic surgery trials in Kenya, and natural language processing tools in dozens of indigenous languages. We're not just users of technology anymore. We're creators." and the world will have to get used to seeing Made in Africa on more than just coffee and cocoa. Musk, known for his charisma, gave a half smile and nodded, visibly taken aback. His typical witty retorts failed to materialize. The rest of the panel shifted dramatically, with multiple speakers turning their focus to African contributions and the need for decentralizing AI development. Dr. Mbatha became an overnight sensation. Her speech went viral, translated into multiple languages, and became required viewing in tech ethics courses worldwide. Universities invited her to speak. African startups reached out for mentorship. International tech firms began publicly pledging investments into African tech ecosystems, not out of charity, but out of recognition of emerging brilliance. The exchange marked a pivotal moment, a redefining of who gets to lead the conversation on technology. Africa, once considered the next frontier, was no longer waiting to be discovered. It was already building the future, and finally it was being heard. Not long after the world had watched tech leaders and presidents be challenged by bold African voices, another striking moment occurred, this time at the prestigious Global Economic Reform Conference in Zurich. The event brought together world financial powerhouses including IMF directors, central bank governors, and private equity giants. Sitting quietly in the corner, however, was someone unexpected. Amadou Diop, a 19-year-old economics student from Senegal, attending as a youth delegate from the African Development Fellowship. During a high-stakes panel discussion on global debt restructuring, Christine Lambert, the CEO of a major European investment firm, confidently declared, "Frankly, African nations need to accept financial discipline. They borrow too much, produce too little, and expect forgiveness instead of accountability. It's unsustainable economics." There was a sharp silence. The words felt harsh, patronizing, and reeking of double standards. When the moderator unexpectedly offered the floor to a youth representative for comment, all eyes turned to Amadou Diop, the youngest person in the room. He stood slowly, adjusted his glasses, and spoke in a voice that was calm, but carried the weight of generations. "With all due respect, Madame Lambert," he began, "when European nations borrowed after World War II, no one asked if they produced enough. They were given the Marshall Plan, billions in aid, forgiveness, and rebuilding, without being lectured on accountability. Why is it that when Africa borrows to build hospitals, roads, and schools, we are treated like reckless children?" Gasps filled the room. He continued, "The global financial system was not designed by us, yet we are expected to follow its rules blindly. We pay billions in debt interest to the same institutions that once colonized us and now preach fairness. That is not discipline, that is a cycle, and we are ready to break it." Applause erupted, cameras turned. People in suits who hadn't looked up from their phones were suddenly paying attention. Lambert, momentarily frozen, attempted to respond with a brief nod and the usual rhetoric about shared responsibility, but the energy in the room had already shifted. Within hours, clips of Amadou's remarks flooded social media. African youth hailed him as a voice of the next generation, one not intimidated by titles or wealth, but informed, fearless, and unapologetically proud. Major Ney, African economist, praised his precision. Media outlets in Europe and America debated the ethics of modern debt structures. For the first time in years, global South equity wasn't just a buzzword. It was being demanded by name, with real voices behind it. And at the center of it was a teenager from Dakar who had the courage to speak when most would have stayed silent. Amadou Diop reminded the world that intellect has no age, and that truth, when spoken with courage, is impossible to ignore. The scene was the World Food and Agriculture Summit in Rome, an annual gathering where global leaders, billionaires, and food security experts discussed the state of global hunger, food tech, and sustainability. On the stage sat familiar faces, CEOs of massive agribusiness corporations, European ministers, and celebrity philanthropists. But nestled among them was someone few recognized, Mariam Nanyonga, a 32-year-old agroecologist from Uganda. Mariam was not a CEO. She wasn't backed by a billion-dollar foundation, but she had spent over a decade building sustainable farming cooperatives in rural East Africa, helping thousands of women grow food organically and profitably on small plots of land. Midway through the event, Lord Reginald Clark, a British agricultural magnate, made a bold assertion. "Traditional farming in Africa is outdated," he said. "If we're to feed the world, Africans must adopt genetically modified crops, precision farming, and high-tech Western methods. Otherwise, they'll remain dependent and hungry." Polite applause followed from some corners, but Mariam calmly leaned forward, requested the mic, and spoke. "With respect, Lord Clark," she began, "you sell tractors to people who have no roads. You push fertilizers that poison our soil, then offer loans to buy the antidote. You call us dependent, but it is your system that chains us." The room went quiet. "We feed our people with cow dung compost, seed sharing, and ancestral wisdom. Our methods aren't primitive, they're regenerative, and they work. In my village, yields have doubled without chemicals. Children eat organic. Mothers sell surplus at markets, no debt, no dependency, just dignity." Then her words struck like lightning. "The real question isn't whether African farming is outdated. The real question is, why is your billion-dollar system still producing hunger?" The silence was deafening. Even the moderators didn't know what to say. Within minutes, her words were circulating on social media. African farmers shared her speech with pride. Youth groups across the continent replayed her message in classrooms and town halls. Activists abroad called her the voice of food sovereignty. Big agri-CEOs who once dismissed her as just a grassroots activist suddenly scrambled to revise their PR statements. Governments in Africa began re-evaluating their agricultural partnerships. And Mariam. She returned to Uganda to find her community welcoming her as a hero, not for fighting, but for speaking the truth so clearly the world couldn't pretend not to hear. She didn't just defend African farming. She redefined its future in African terms.